1975. A priest collapsed mid-mass, but it took 40 years to discover what he swallowed. They say a moment can divide a life, before and after. For the congregation of St. Adelaide's Parish, that moment came at precisely 11:42 a.m. on a spring morning in 1975, when Father Mallory collapsed mid-sentence during the Eucharist. 1 second, his voice was rising with reverence, holding the host aloft. The next, he fell forward, arms wide, as though crucified by something unseen. At first, the parishioners thought it was part of a dramatic gesture, a spiritual intensity, but the silence that followed, it wasn't sacred. It was terrifying. 40 years later, people still remembered exactly where they were seated. Geraldine Summers, now 82, said she remembered the way his cassock fluttered like a dropped curtain. "It was like God turned the lights off," she whispered to a reporter once. 1 second he was there, the next he was gone. The newspapers called it an act of God. Cardiac arrest, the coroner said. Natural causes. No autopsy. The body was buried within 72 hours. There were sermons about fragility, grief, divine timing, and then nothing. Life went on. Except not quite, because something about that day never quite settled for Nora Hensley. She was only 14 when it happened, sitting 3 pews from the altar, swinging her shoes nervously beneath her mother's sharp gaze. She had never seen a man die before, let alone in God's house. And something in the way Father Mallory fell, in the way his mouth froze open like he was trying to say something, had lodged itself into her chest like a shard of glass. She grew up, went to college, moved states, raised kids. But she couldn't quite shake the memory. There were nights she'd wake with a gasp, hearing the echo of that unfinished word, the syllable caught in his throat before the fall. Years passed. The church aged. Its bricks cracked under Midwest winters. Congregation dwindled. The choir loft was closed for safety. The roof leaked. But the altar remained untouched, as though something holy, or perhaps haunting, had taken root beneath it. In 2015, when the Diocese of Milwaukee approved the historic preservation of St. Adelaide's, they sent a team of archivists, preservationists, and volunteers to begin work. Nora, now a retired schoolteacher, had returned to the town to care for her sister and found herself volunteering at the project, half out of nostalgia, half out of some unfinished ache. The building smelled of mildew and old incense. Her fingers traced dusty hymnals and candle holders left untouched for decades. But it wasn't until week 4, when a section of the sanctuary floor was lifted near the altar, that her breath caught. Beneath a warped plank was a hollowed cavity, lined with stone, about the size of a loaf of bread. The team thought it was a time capsule, but inside was something else. A tarnished patent plate, still holding fragments of dried communion wafer, and beside it, a small gelatin capsule, brownish red, cracked. The team lead, a young woman named Kayla, frowned. "That's not standard," she muttered. "This looks wrong." The local sheriff's office was called, mostly as a formality. They took the capsule, the plate, the wafer remains. They bagged them carefully. No one said the word evidence, but it lingered in the air like smoke. Nora stood back, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew. She knew, the second she saw that capsule nestled where no communion object should ever be, that this was what had stolen his voice. This was what had frozen that unfinished word in his mouth. They tested the capsule weeks later. The results didn't come back quickly, nor loudly, but quietly. In an office with no windows, someone finally said it. Saxitoxin, a marine biotoxin, odorless, tasteless, lethal in micrograms, nearly impossible to trace in 1975, entirely fatal if ingested. And yet there it was, preserved beside the host, waiting. Nora stood by the lake that evening, the report clutched in her hands. The wind tugged at the edges of the paper. She didn't cry, but her knees trembled. This wasn't divine timing. This was murder. And if that was true, then someone somewhere had come to church that day with death in their pocket. The question that haunted Nora wasn't just who, it was why. Why would someone kill a priest in the middle of Mass, using a method so silent it would be written off as holy coincidence? What did he know? What was he trying to say? And above all, why had the church buried it, literally and figuratively, for 40 years? She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she pulled out her old journals, reams of scribbled thoughts, pressed flowers, ticket stubs, prayers. On one brittle page, dated April 6, 1975, she had written just one sentence. His eyes looked at someone before he fell, not upward, but left, toward the choir. She had forgotten that. She hadn't remembered writing it. But now, it screamed at her. The choir, that corner of the church, had been sealed off for decades due to water damage. But what if... She didn't finish the thought. She just closed the book, tucked it beneath her coat, and walked back toward the church. She didn't see the figure across the street watching her, but he saw her, and he remembered her. The choir loft had always been the most neglected part of St. Adelaide's, closed off after the roof caved slightly during a storm in '89, left to gather dust and silence. But that morning, as Nora stood at the base of the winding staircase, a key from the volunteer tool chest shaking in her hand, she felt like she was unlocking more than just a door. She was opening a memory sealed by time, weather, and something heavier, something chosen. The air changed with each creaking step, not just colder, but thicker, like walking into a story that no longer wanted to be told. Dust hung in golden beams, illuminated by the fractured stained glass window that bled dull red onto the warped wood floor. It smelled of mold, candle wax, and something faintly metallic, like the echo of old blood. She hadn't been up there since she was a child, since she wore patent shoes and sat beside her sister while Mr. Claiborne directed the hymns with his long conductor's arms. She could still hear the tinny organ, the off-key sopranos. She remembered the boy next to her, Daniel Harrow, chewing the inside of his cheek, fidgeting with the cuffs of his choir robe. Daniel. He was 15 in 1975, blond, tall, always with that pale, anxious look, like he was trying to shrink inside himself. He sang well, soft but clear. His voice used to catch just slightly on the word mercy, and then one day he disappeared. Not immediately after Father Mallory's death, But soon enough. Moved away, they said. Ill family, some said. Never really fit in, others offered. No goodbye, no letter, no forwarding address, just gone. And the thing was, no one asked. Not then. Not really. Nora exhaled slowly, forcing the stale air out of her lungs, and walked across the creaking floorboards toward the old bench where the choir used to warm up. The window above it was cracked, ivy sneaking through the seams, as though the earth itself wanted to witness what was left. She ran her fingers along the carved initials in the wood. RB, ST, DH. Still there? Daniel's mark. Small and neat. Beneath the bench, something caught her eye, a faint outline in the dust. She knelt, heart drumming against her ribs. A stack of yellowed sheet music was tucked behind one of the support beams. It looked untouched for decades, the top page brittle, curling with age. She pulled it out. It was an arrangement of the hymn, Lead Kindly Light, annotated in delicate pencil. She recognized the handwriting. It was Daniel's, his cursive looping and careful. In the margin, beneath the line, "The night is dark, and I am far from home," was a note. He asked me to wait, but I can't stay quiet forever. Her fingers trembled. She flipped through the rest of the sheets. On the back of the final page was a date. April 4th, 1975. 2 days before Father Mallory died. And beneath it, a name, hastily scrawled in the corner. Claiborne. Nora sat back on her heels, the choir bench suddenly too small to hold what she was feeling. Claiborne, the choir director, always so exact, always so present. She tried to recall his face now, and what came to her wasn't his voice or his hands, but his eyes. How often they were already looking before she turned, watching. Could he have? The thought felt monstrous, but the name was there, and it hadn't written itself. She stood, too fast, her knees aching from the years. She needed to breathe, to think, to get out of that loft. But as she turned toward the stairs, her shoe caught the edge of a board. Something lifted. Not a trapdoor, not a panel, just a loose piece of wood, almost nothing. She bent down again and slid it fully open. Inside was a small compartment, maybe 12 inches deep. Inside that, a photograph, old, cracked, but unmistakable. It was a picture of Father Mallory, standing beside Mr. Claiborne, with Daniel Harrow in the middle. Their faces were still, unsure, smiling, but only halfway. And on the back of the photo, written in the same looping cursive as the hymn, was a sentence that turned her blood cold. If I disappear, tell them to look behind the altar. The room spun. The years collapsed into each other. It wasn't just that Father Mallory had been poisoned. It was that someone had tried to say it long ago, but no one had listened. Now, someone was listening. And someone else, someone who thought the truth had died with the priest, was about to realize it hadn't. She didn't sleep that night. The photograph lay on her kitchen table, weighed down by a coffee mug she hadn't touched in hours. Its steam had long vanished, just like the heat in her chest. Nora sat in silence, wrapped in her father's old wool cardigan, rocking slowly in the chair as the refrigerator hummed and the wind scraped tree limbs across her windows. She kept reading the line, "If I disappear, tell them to look behind the altar." Each time it felt heavier. She wanted to believe it was a boy's imagination, some scribbled drama invented in the angst of adolescence. But that didn't explain why the photo was hidden, or why Daniel never told anyone in person, or why the man who stood beside him in that photo, Mr. Claiborne, had quietly retired 2 months after the priest's sudden death and left town without so much as a farewell potluck. She picked up the photo again and stared at Daniel's face. He looked so young, just a kid. But his eyes, they weren't a child's. They were burdened, tired, aware. Nora knew that look because she saw it in the mirror. The next morning, she drove straight to the historical committee office. The old courthouse had been converted into a part-time archive and grant office for town preservation projects. Half its shelves were filled with brittle records no one had digitized, and the other half with boxes of material donated by families who didn't want their grandkids to throw them out. Dust lived longer than memory in this place. She stepped inside, heart quickening. "Gloria?" she called, voice low but urgent. From behind a tall stack of binders, a silver bun appeared. Gloria Morrison, head of the committee and keeper of every whispered rumor in St. Adelaide's, adjusted her glasses. "Nora, you all right, honey? You look like you saw a ghost." "I might have." That made Gloria set her coffee down. 10 minutes later, they sat in the back room, the door closed. Nora laid out the photo, the sheet music, and the notes. Gloria listened without interrupting. Her lips pursed into a hard, colorless line. When it was done, she said only, "Well, damn." "You remember Daniel Harrow?" "Vaguely," Gloria replied. "Sweet kid, real quiet. Vanished before graduation, if I recall. His mother moved out west not long after. I assumed it was a family relocation." Nora shook her head. There was never a forwarding address, no school transfer, no contact. I called 3 alumni from that year. None of them heard from him again after April 75. "You think Claiborne?" "I don't know what I think," Nora said. "But this isn't just some forgotten drama club script. Someone knew something, and they wrote it down in fear. Now he's gone. And so is Father Mallory." Gloria stared at the photo again. "What are you hoping to find?" Nora paused. Closure. She didn't say justice. That word had lost meaning years ago. Gloria finally nodded. "Let me get you something." She returned with a slim, brown box, thin as a photo album. "Renovation records. This town doesn't keep much, but we've got everything filed if it involved a tax write-off. The church applied for altar repairs in 76, said it was to replace a cracked foundation stone, but the work was approved by Claiborne himself. Unusual, since that's not typically a choir director's domain." Nora's fingers twitched. "Do you know who did the work?" "Name here says Henry Briggs. Died in 94. His son lives 2 towns over, Kyle Briggs." That afternoon, she drove, not fast, not frantic, just determined. Kyle Briggs answered the door with paint on his jeans and a carpenter's pencil behind his ear. When she asked about the altar, his face went still, eyes narrowing like shutters drawing closed. "I was 17, he said, after a long pause. "But I remember. My dad brought me on the job as a helper. Said it was hush-hush. Church wanted a cavity sealed behind the old altar. There was a pocket, like a crawl space, about 2 feet deep, maybe 6 feet long. I held the flashlight. Did you see anything inside? He hesitated. Yeah, a blanket, rolled up. Looked like it had stains. He told me not to ask questions. We sealed it in with fresh mortar and stone. Nora's breath caught. Did he say why? No, but I remember the man who supervised. Tall, thin, stern, black coat, always. Didn't look like a priest. Looked rehearsed. Claiborne. I don't know his name, but he paid in cash. That night, Nora sat in her car outside the church for almost an hour. The brick walls that once meant weddings, christenings, warmth, they now held a silence too dense to breathe through. She called the state's cold case unit, left no name, just one message. There may be human remains behind the altar at St. Adelaide's, buried in 1975, likely a minor, possibly connected to the death of Father Mallory. Please don't ignore this. Then she turned off her phone. She needed time to think, to plan, to remember. The next morning, she drove to a nursing home on the edge of town. It was where they'd put Mr. Claiborne. He was 91, still alive, still breathing in a sunlit room with wind chimes and daffodils in a vase. She entered without knocking. The moment their eyes met, he smiled, faint, but real. Nora, he rasped, you were always sharp. She sat slowly. You remember me. You were always watching, like you knew music wasn't the only thing happening in that church. She didn't answer. He looked past her toward the window. So it's come back. You know why I'm here. I always knew someone would come, he said, voice hollow, but I expected it would be Daniel. Her hands clenched. What happened to him? He blinked. He told. Silence. Then softer. He told the priest. And the priest didn't believe him. Nora's stomach turned. Not at first, Claiborne added, but then something shifted. The priest started watching me during rehearsal. He'd ask questions. Daniel was pulled from the choir, told to go home. But he stayed. He watched. And then? One night, he cornered me in the choir loft, said he'd written it all down, said if anything happened to him, someone would know. He smiled faintly. I told him that wasn't enough. The room felt colder now. You hurt him. No, Claiborne said softly. I didn't have to. Then who did? He closed his eyes. The priest. Nora froze. What? Father Mallory was not innocent. He was guilty of looking away, of fear. But when he finally believed the boy, he confronted me. Too late. I knew he'd report me, that I'd lose everything, so I made a choice. Her voice was shaking. You poisoned him. Claiborne didn't deny it. I put it in the host. I wanted it to look divine, sudden, like punishment from heaven. Why? She whispered. He opened his eyes, pale as bleached glass. Because secrets stay quiet when the mouth that speaks them is closed. She stood, knees trembling. I've already told someone, she said. Good, Claiborne whispered. Then maybe Daniel will stop singing in my dreams. Nora walked out without looking back. That night, as the sun dipped behind the spire of St. Adelaide's, 2 state vehicles pulled into the church's side entrance. And for the first time in 40 years, someone started chipping away at the altar. And beneath the stone, beneath the hush, beneath the years of silence, a blanket waited. Just like Daniel said. The smell hit first. It was faint at first, almost like mildew. But as the workers chipped deeper into the back wall of the altar, a darker odor bled out, one that didn't belong in a house of worship. Nora stood behind the crime scene tape, arms crossed tightly against her chest, a scarf wrapped around her mouth, though she knew it wouldn't keep the smell out. Deke had a way of slipping past fabric, past logic, past time itself. Beside her, Detective Carla Moen scribbled notes in a worn leather pad. She'd driven in from the capital that morning, called in on the tip left 2 nights prior. Nora hadn't said a word about being the caller. She didn't need to. Moen had pieced it together the moment they met. "You grew up here," the detective had said when they first shook hands. Not a question, a knowing. People don't sniff this kind of trail unless they've already bled on it. Now, the workers had stopped. One of them dropped his chisel. His face had turned pale as limestone. He backed away, hand covering his mouth, eyes locked on the dark pocket behind the last slab. Moen stepped forward. "What do you see?" she asked, voice level. The man didn't answer, so Moen climbed up herself. She crouched, slowly reached in with gloved hands, and pulled the first item from the crevice. It was a blanket, tattered, brown-red stains across the folds. It crunched slightly as she unfolded it, the fibers long hardened by time and moisture. And inside, wrapped in silence and damp cloth, was a human jawbone. Small, too small. Moen didn't flinch. She simply nodded and radioed in for a forensic team. "We're going to need the anthropologist from State Lab. Possibly child-sized remains. Skull fragments confirmed. Clothing fiber consistent with 1970s textiles." This wasn't a hiding place. It was a grave. Nora had already known that. She hadn't cried. Not yet. Not when the jawbone emerged. Not when the technician whispered the words, "juvenile male." Not when the cross that had been buried with him, small, wooden, a choir pin tied to the base, was laid out in the evidence tray. But she did cry when they handed her the rest of the notebook. It was found tucked deeper in the cavity, behind the remains, wrapped in the remnants of what looked like a lunch bag. Mold had eaten the corners, but the ink survived. Daniel's handwriting. Neat, slanted slightly to the right, still etched with that same shaky courage. The last page was a date, April 18th, 1975, followed by a single sentence. "He said if I speak, he'll put me where no song can reach me," and he had. The news broke 2 days later. It started as a leak, an anonymous tip to a local paper. The story was picked up by a regional podcast. Then the national true crime bloggers sank their teeth in. Remains of a minor discovered beneath historic St. Adelaide's church altar in Missouri. Possible murder linked to 1975 poisoning of priest. By the time CNN asked for an interview, Nora had already turned her phone off. She didn't want fame. She didn't want vindication. She just wanted to know why everyone let this happen. Gloria called her that night, voice heavy with disbelief. "You should have seen the town hall," she said. "Half the board is scrambling for statements. The bishop's office won't answer questions. They're pretending like this never happened. But people remember Daniel now, even ones who didn't." Nora sat on her porch, eyes scanning the stars. "They're not pretending," she said quietly. "They truly forgot. That's worse." 3 days later, Moen called. "Claiborne passed." "What?" "In his sleep, 2 nights ago. Stroke. Nora's mind reeled. So he'll never face trial? No, but that's not why I called. Moen paused. The forensic team confirmed the remains, DNA matched with a distant cousin. It's Daniel. It's officially Daniel Harrow. Nora closed her eyes, then opened them again. There's something else, Moen added. We found a second set of prints on the notebook. Partial, but viable. Not Daniel's. Not Claiborne's either. Who? We're still running it, but you'll want to sit down when we get the result. The call ended, and silence returned. The next day, Nora received a package. No return address, just her name, written in clean cursive, on the front of a small manila envelope. Inside, a VHS tape. She had to borrow a player from the local library. They brought one out from a dusty storage room, cords tangled, remote barely working. She played the tape in one of the archive rooms. The footage was grainy, black and white, but familiar. It was the choir. St. Adelaide's Youth Ensemble, spring 1975. She could see them, boys and girls in matching robes, swaying as they sang. The camera panned slowly, deliberately. The frame held Daniel longer than the others. Then it moved to the choir loft. There, in the shadows, was Claiborne, hands folded, watching, and behind him, another man, tall, balding, wearing a priest's collar, Father Mallory. But something was off. His gaze wasn't focused on the choir. He was looking at the camera, straight into it, like he knew. Nora paused the tape, zoomed in. The quality blurred, but the eyes were unmistakable. They weren't fearful. They were pleading. This wasn't the face of a man complicit. It was the face of someone who saw too late and couldn't stop what was already moving. Nora leaned back, heart pounding. What if Claiborne wasn't alone? What if Father Mallory hadn't just been a coward, but a man caught between truth and silence? And what if someone else? The phone rang. It was Moen. We got the second print. Who? There was a pause. Then, Bishop Harold Essman, retired. But back then, he was the assistant chaplain, the man in charge of internal investigations. Nora's breath stopped. He ordered the altar sealed, Moen continued. He signed the paperwork. He oversaw the funeral for Father Mallory. He was there the night the renovations were done. Nora stood, palms pressed to the table. He knew. Yes, Moen said. And if this tape is real, he knew who Daniel was. He knew what happened. And he buried them both. Outside, the church bells rang noon. But inside Nora's chest, it sounded more like war drums. She wasn't done yet. There was still a voice left to raise. And now, she had proof that even the choir couldn't drown it. The church looked different at night. Its spire no longer reached toward heaven, but stood like a broken finger against the navy sky. Shadows spilled over the entrance steps, pooling in the corners where the streetlight had long stopped working. Nora sat in her parked car across the street, headlights off, watching the doors like they could breathe. She hadn't been back inside since the discovery. Not since Daniel was brought out wrapped in bags instead of a choir robe. But something inside her itched, an ache she couldn't locate, only obey. She stepped out. The wind carried the faint scent of rain, though the sky was dry. Keys in hand, she approached the door. The padlock was gone. The yellow tape fluttered like tired ribbon. The investigation was closed, but Nora's war had just begun. The sanctuary welcomed her with silence. No organ, no prayers, just the sound of her own heartbeat growing louder the further she walked in. She didn't need the lights. Her feet remembered the path, past the pews, past the pulpit, toward the altar where truth had been buried twice, once in death, once in silence. She sat on the front row and stared. How many times had Daniel sung here? How many times had Claiborne stood over them, preaching with poisoned hands? And how many people knew and did nothing? Her hands clenched. The bishop's name, Harold Esmond, burned in her mind like acid. He was alive, retired, living in a gated community 2 hours south, protected by title, shielded by time. But he had signed the order. He had locked the bones beneath holy stone and let a murderer preach over them. And now, finally, there was evidence. The VHS tape, the fingerprints, the logbook showing his approval of the altar's reconstruction. It was enough to trigger a new investigation. Barely. But Moen had warned her. Esmond has lawyers, a PR firm, and friends in high places. This won't be a court case. This'll be a siege. And Nora was just one woman. But that had never stopped her before. Back in her apartment, she laid it all out. Timeline, paperwork, copies of the tape, a printout of Daniel's notebook. She even had a letter, unsigned, mailed anonymously 2 days ago. It said only, Mallory didn't jump. He was pushed, but not by Claiborne. That single sentence shattered the tidy narrative they had built. If true, it meant Claiborne wasn't the only monster in the room. And it meant the bishop wasn't just complicit, he was operational. But who had sent it? And why now? Nora stared at her laptop. A new email blinked. No sender. Subject line, watch carefully. Attached, a still image from the VHS tape. She clicked. It was paused on a frame from the choir rehearsal. Daniel, standing to the left, mouth open mid-hymn. Claiborne behind him, expression unreadable. But on the far left, partially cropped, was another figure. A hand, a collar, and a ring. A bishop's ring. Esmond's ring. It wasn't just that he was there. He was in the frame, literally, in the room, watching it all. And that changed everything. Nora stood, chest tight. She grabbed her notes, packed them into a folder, and slid them into a courier envelope. Then she printed 2 copies of the image, one for the DA, one for the press. She wasn't going to wait for the system anymore. That night, she uploaded the image anonymously to 3 true crime subreddits and an online community called Voices Unburied. Within hours, the post exploded. Titled, Bishop Harold Esmond watched the choir that year. Look left. Over 400 comments, dozens of reposts, and finally, a direct message. From an account called Sparrow 1976, it read, I know what he did. He paid for silence. Mallory tried to stop it. I was there. Nora's fingers trembled. She replied instantly. Who are you? Silence. Then another message. Meet me at the old rectory, Saturday, midnight. Come alone. She stared at the screen, pulse hammering. It could be a trap, or a hoax, but it could also be the only witness left alive. Saturday came slowly. Nora arrived early. The rectory was a skeletal husk now. Windows boarded, roofs sunken in places. But the back door was ajar. just enough to suggest invitation or warning. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memory. She walked slowly, flashlight sweeping across peeling walls. In the chapel corner, an old piano slumped against the wall, its keys yellowed like teeth. Then she heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate. She turned. A man stood in the doorway, face cloaked in the hood of his coat. His hands were bare, older, weathered. His voice broke the silence like a match to dry wood. "I was a janitor, 1974 to 1976. Name's Grant." Nora didn't speak. "I cleaned the sacristy," he continued. "I saw Claiborne argue with Mallory the night before the priest died. It wasn't about doctrine. It was about Daniel." "What happened?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Mallory found out. About what Claiborne was doing to the boys. He told him he was going to the bishop, said he'd testify, turn him in, save them. "But he didn't," Nora said. "No," Grant said bitterly, because that same night, Mallory fell down the rectory stairs, broke his neck. The paper said he tripped, but I found the rail broken. Looked like someone tore it out after the fact. He took a shaky breath. And the bishop came that night, not the next day, not for the funeral, that night. Told us all to stay silent. Promised Claiborne was being reassigned, but he never left. And Daniel, he trailed off. Nora stared, heart racing. "Why are you telling me this now?" Grant looked up, eyes hollow. "Because I still hear his voice. The boy. He used to hum when he swept the pews. Same 3 notes, over and over. And sometimes I think, if I had spoken up, maybe he'd still be humming somewhere." Silence swallowed them both. Then Nora stepped forward, placing the folder in his hands. "This is everything I have. Take it to the press." He hesitated. "You're not afraid?" "I am," she said, "but I'm more afraid of silence." Outside, the night was still. But inside Nora, something had awakened. A resolve deeper than anger. A song louder than fear. She didn't know it yet, but within 24 hours, the image would go viral, and within 72, a subpoena would land on the desk of Bishop Harold Essman. But it started here, with a whisper in the dark. There are bells in every church. Some ring to mark weddings, others to mourn the dead. But the bell at St. Bridget's hadn't rung in decades. Its chain rusted to the rafters, its clapper fused in silence. No one had climbed the narrow spiral stairs in years. No reason to. Not until a maintenance order filed for weather damage led a rookie technician to the tower in the spring of 2024. And there, on the inside wall, behind the massive bronze bell, he saw it, etched faintly into the stone. 5 words. He buried him behind the altar. At first, they dismissed it. Graffiti, maybe. A prank. But the handwriting was small, shaky, almost desperate, like someone had carved it in the dark, with fingers trembling. Forensics dated the markings to roughly 1993, the same year Daniel Mallory disappeared. In the same week, Father Claiborne suffered a breakdown and was quietly moved to a mental facility. When the image of the carving hit the internet, the firestorm was instant. The Reddit post had already brought attention, but this was gasoline on open flame. Cable news picked it up. True crime podcasts devoured it. And suddenly, A Boy Forgotten became a headline. Daniel's name trended for the first time in 3 decades. Nora, watched it all unfold from her kitchen, coffee untouched. It felt surreal. Victory, if it could be called that, didn't taste sweet. It tasted like ash. Because Daniel was still gone. Because no one had gone to prison. Because Bishop Essman had checked into a private facility the day before the warrant was issued. Heart complications, his lawyer said. Of course, the system knew how to shield its own, but something had changed. Nora could feel it. Whispers were turning into voices. People were starting to talk. 3 more men came forward in the weeks that followed. Each told nearly the same story. Boys, choir robes, a locked side room near the sacristy. Claiborne's voice behind them, whispering prayers that didn't match any liturgy they'd ever known, and one of them, a man named Peter Monroe, had a letter, dated 1994, from Claiborne himself. It read, "I did not act alone." Nora stared at that sentence over and over. It was real. Verified. The paper aged, the ink consistent with other samples from the same year. But the most chilling part? At the bottom, a second hand had written a single word in different ink. Destroy. Whoever had received that letter had been ordered to erase it. But they didn't. They kept it. And 29 years later, it became a match to the same handwriting that etched the message inside the bell tower. The DOJ opened a special inquiry. Not into Claiborne. He was dead. But into the diocese's cover-up procedures. They called it the Mallory docket. Nora was summoned as a witness. She sat in a cold room under fluorescent lights, across from men in tailored suits who asked the same question in a dozen different ways. What made you pursue this? She didn't mention the dream, the one where she was back in the church, but the pews were empty, where the choir's voices were replaced by a single note, Daniel's note, humming through the walls. She didn't say how sometimes she still smelled incense in her sleep, even though the sanctuary hadn't been used in years. She just said the truth. I was tired of waiting for permission to care. That seemed to shake them. The inquiry resulted in 2 resignations, 1 federal audit, and the reclassification of Daniel Mallory's case from missing person to homicide with credible witness testimony. It wasn't justice, but it was a beginning. Months later, they tore up the altar. It was early morning, cold, quiet. Nora stood at the edge of the work site in a yellow vest, clipboard in hand. Not because she worked there, but because she had asked to be present. She needed to be. The stone cracked after hours of drilling, and beneath it, exactly beneath it, they found the cavity. A small, hollow space. No coffin, just a decayed robe, a gold pin, a rosary, and what remained of a teenage boy who hadn't made it home in 1993. Nora didn't cry. Not then. She just knelt, placed her hand on the earth, and whispered, "You're not forgotten." Daniel Mallory was buried again, this time properly, with music, with flowers, with names said aloud. And as the casket lowered, one of the choir members who had sung with him, now a man in his 50s, stepped forward. He cleared his throat and hummed, just 3 notes, soft, broken, sacred. It was the same melody Daniel used to hum while sweeping the pews. Nora felt something shift in the air, closure maybe, or just the sound of something long sealed finally breathing again. The church remained empty after that. No one wanted to buy it. So the city turned it into a memorial. A plaque at the entrance reads, "In memory of those silenced and those who refused to stay silent." It doesn't name names. It doesn't have to. Sometimes, truth isn't a verdict. It's a voice. It's a crack in the stone. It's a bell that doesn't ring, but still echoes. And in that silence, something holy returns.